Let's welcome us back into video number 15. This is going to be our very last video of time period 3, so this is the season finale of season 3. We are still outside of my house, so if you hear any birds in the background or the air conditioner, that's it. So for this last piece of the puzzle that we need to have to be able to go into World War I at that very end, 1914, it's going to be imperialism. So there's a couple of different causes for imperialism. Number one is going to be that search for new markets and raw material. We are long past the days of the age of exploration, where we can count on the new things that are bringing in from the Americas. Those resources have either been used up or they've created independent nations that are no longer colonies, sort of like the United States. And so now we need more raw materials to keep up production and keep at that high level that we've come to expect, that high level of wealth. You're also going to see missionary movements. Unfortunately, a lot of these missionary movements are not always the purest of heart based. You're going to still see a lot of that whole God forced conversion sort of thing as we're moving into Africa and into Asia. We need an increase in military bases. We need to have that growth of militarism. That's going to be a major factor for the causes of World War I. And a place to be able to dock your ships and refuel is going to be more important as we have this also an increase of technology with the industrial and the technical revolutions that are happening. So that's number 4. At the time, we now are able to better and fully expand and go places that we could never go before. We have better technology with the steam engine and with cars, and now we have roads and locomotives. We could never go these places before. And then this last idea is just the ideology of exploration. Unfortunately, with Rudyard Kipling's The Burden of the White Man, that's what a lot of Europeans believed, that it was the white European viewpoint that needed to civilize the world, that their civilizations were not enough, and that they needed the white influence to become civilized Christian people. You're first gonna kind of see this happening in Africa, the African cake being divided into different sections. Great Britain takes over Egypt and ends up building the Suez Canal, which becomes a major crisis in the 1950s. They also try to take over South Africa, and they end up having to fight 2 Boer wars to be able to get control over South Africa. And there's still a lot of British influence in South Africa today. And the biggest thing to kind of remember as far as taking over Africa with Great Britain is that just because they don't have the same firepower does not mean that the African peoples just accepted defeat. One of the greatest examples of a resistance movement is going to be against the British in the Zulu Wars. Now, they're not being able to be successful because when you're fighting against guns and you have sticks, unfortunately the firepower will end up winning. But it's a massive resistance. They're not willingly being taken over. France ends up taking Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. Italy keeps Libya, which becomes a factor later on when we're talking about World War II and the World War II battles in Africa. So anything south of the Sahara becomes part of Belgium, Germany, and French. When we're thinking about King Leopold taking over the Congo and that huge middle portion of Africa, you're also going to see David Livingstone. He's going to be our first white missionary into Africa and ends up becoming a part of the people and living in Africa for a huge portion of his life. In Asia, there is also going to be a massive influence of imperialism. Again, not always the most generous and fair takeover, and most of the time it's not going to be easily welcomed. One of these revolutions is going to be in India versus Great Britain with the Sepoy Mutiny. Part of that was just because they had there was a casing made out of pig, and because of the Hindu religion, they did not agree. The Hindus of India did not agree with this and tried to rise up and ended up failing. India did not gain independence until after World War II with Gandhi, but that was one example. Great Britain also managed to take Burma, the Malay Peninsula, and North Borneo, which is later renamed to other country names. But Great Britain kind of took a good page out of their book as far as letting the still existing government have mostly control over the region and just sort of being there as an economic hold. The Dutch took over the Dutch East Indies, which is Indonesia now, with a whole bunch of island countries, which helped with their Dutch East India Trading Company. The French took over Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, which ended up causing a massive, massive problem after World War II when they tried to retake Vietnam, and it ended up causing this whole Vietnamese conflict that the United States got involved in later. China has been a lot more open than some of the other Asian countries at this time period. They had been forced to cede land and areas to the West because they had a greater firepower. There is this thing called the Taiping Rebellion from 1850 to 1864, which the United States and the United Kingdom had to come in and stop and put down the rebellion. After this, we have this open door policy that the United States sets up, where basically any country in from the Western Hemisphere can have a sphere of influence in China as far as trading without having to necessarily have a political dominance. The people who didn't really like that are Chinese nationalists called the Boxers, and there is this thing called the Boxer Rebellion, in which they try to gain more independence and kick out all the Westerners. Ultimately, the Boxer Rebellion was a failure, and that was not successful. Japan is going to be the biggest increase in as far as independence for Asian countries. So Japan is going to be, as a lot of other Asian countries are going to be shut off from the rest of the world, way far behind in medieval times. But an American whose name is Commander Matthew Perry, he is going to have this opening the door to Japan, and that's going to be a huge revolution for Japan. The shogun, who had been the ruler of Japan for a very long time, is replaced by a very powerful empire, and he wants Japan to get on the same standards as the Western civilizations. And so they have to modernize Japan very, very quickly, and it's called the Meiji, I believe, Restoration. And they actually are very successful in bringing Japan very quickly into competition and to also becoming an imperialistic nation. And so Japan is going to try to create this imperialistic nation by invading other islands, which ends up getting them involved later in World War II. But before they get involved in World War II, there's this thing called the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, when they are attacking a section of contested land between Japan and Russia, and everyone is very surprised when the Japanese end up winning the war after the peace agreement by Theodore Roosevelt. And that's going to be a huge indicator to everybody that the Russians are here to stay and that they are extremely powerful. This boost of power and this boost of esteem leads to the eventual rape of Nanjing, which is when the Japanese attacked an area of Manchuria and then going down into China, raping and beheading and brutalizing a lot of Chinese people. Unfortunately, this is not recognized by the Japanese government today. However, this is an important part of, if you are comparing, you could do a unicorn part between the rape of Nanjing and the brutal conquests in different parts of the United States, or not the United States, a part of Nazi Germany with Hitler and his concentration camps. So when we're talking about the effects of imperialism, this is going to worldwide set up a westernized education system, spreading the Western cultural way further into Asia and into Africa that still exists in those countries today. There's going to be an increase in self-determination with the end of colonialism and an increase in that nationalism. There's also going to signify communism, as communism grows at the end of imperialism. And once the time period of imperialism ends, after World War II, that's a huge major signifier that there is a decline in Europe, because they no longer are spread throughout the whole world but are confined to the European continent. So the very, very last part of time period 3 is bordering right on the start of 1914 with World War I. So there are 5 causes that you have to remember, and you can use the acronym MANIA to remember the 5 causes for the start of World War I. The number 1 is going to be, or MANIA, M, is going to be an increase in militarism, which is keeping those military bases all over, increasing the sheer amount of technology, and killing each other at much higher rates than we ever have before. Alliances, the main part of the reason why we have these alliances is because of Bismarck. Bismarck is going to have tons of secret alliances. Specifically, he sets up this thing in the Congress of Berlin in 1878 to be able to talk about the Balkan crisis and all the Balkan wars that are happening at the time. It's also a way for him to get more land and a way for him to set up these secret alliances. There's going to finally be a unification of France and Great Britain together. They have been lifelong enemies for a long time up until this point, and then they have managed to join together against Germany. Germany is not pleased with this, and it mostly happens in Africa, as Africa is being taken over. Great Britain and France join that league together, which you're going to see in World War I and World War II. And then after, which ends up not being super good for Germany, there's going to be that growth of nationalism that we're going to see through things like the Balkan Wars. So the Balkan Wars is really a contest of nationalism, of wanting national independence from the Ottoman Empire, which had grouped all these countries together in Yugoslavia. And instead of having one Yugoslavic country, these all independent countries wanted their own independence. And then Great Britain, France, and Russia start to take sides on who is going to have what of the piece of the pie and who's going to have control. And that tension ends up building into the assassination of the Archduke, which causes World War I. So militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and then last of all, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. So part of the reason of that Archduke Ferdinand is that there were Serbian nationalists who are not very pleased with what was happening with Austria-Hungary being so aggressive and taking over Bosnia and Herzegovina, and taking over and taking pieces of land and being very aggressive with Serbia. And Austria-Hungary has an alliance with Germany, and so when the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary gets assassinated by Serbian nationalists, this is when the alliance system is triggered, and this causes World War I.